Without further ado, I would like to go through some of our introductions for our speakers today. Dr. Jerry Bell is a hurricane climate specialist and research meteorologist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Climate Prediction Center. Dr. Bell specializes in monitoring global climate variability, especially patterns related to El Nino. Dr. Bell is a lead forecaster for NOAA's Atlantic Hurricane Outlook. He joined the Texas General Land Office for our first Hurricane Outlook webinar last year, and he is coming back again to give his expert outlook for the 2020 hurricane season. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Bell. Heather LaGrone is the Senior Deputy Director of the Community Development and Revitalization Division at the Texas General Land Office. Heather is responsible for directing the disaster recovery activities and programming here at the GLO. Heather has been working in disaster recovery, HUD, CDBGR programming, and community affairs for over 19 years. Mark Havens is the Chief Clerk and Deputy Land Commissioner for the Texas Land Commissioner, George P. Bush, and he is responsible for managing all aspects of the agency. Mark has over 16 years of experience in civil litigation, oil and gas, and executive management. Mr. Havens speaks frequently throughout the state on topics related to riparian and littoral boundary disputes, the development of oil and gas on state lands, and legislative impacts on the energy sector. George Prescott Bush is a native Texan born in Houston and elected Texas Land Commissioner in November of 2014. Following Hurricane Harvey, Governor Greg Abbott tapped Commissioner Bush and the GLO to be the first ever state agency to partner with FEMA on a short-term housing mission. He is now leading the long-term housing recovery and mitigation missions funded with approximately $10 billion from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Commissioner Bush to begin this webinar.
Thank you, Jonah, and thank you everybody for joining our webinar. We think that this is an important tradition to continue in the state of Texas, as today is the opening of yet another hurricane season. You know, with COVID-19 and its impact on our state, I think it's more important than ever that as intergovernmental partners that we get together with even thinner resources than ever before into a new hurricane season. So I thought it was important to reconvene our meeting and bring in some of our state's best experts as it relates to disaster recovery. First, I want to thank some of our elected officials who join us today, starting with Senator Larry Taylor, Representative Ed Thompson, Representative Jeannie Morrison, and I believe Representative Ernie Bales is on the line as well. We have so many county judges and mayors that I can't identify each and every one of you. You know who you are. Many of you are in Harvey affected areas and have been important partners at the pointy tip of the spear in fighting and recovering from the most devastating storm in our state's history just 3 years ago. I had a short presentation to put on the screen for you just as a reminder of our role in disaster recovery, because a lot of folks sometimes ask what that role is. And really, it can be broken down into 4 areas. The first is preparing the state for the next storm. We're unique in that we obviously partner with consultation in the legislature and ask for their appropriation and support from the federal government as well. But being the day-to-day point person on behalf of the state, it's important to have an executive agent that is focused on this issue and thinking about it long term. And that's really our primary role. As Jonah had mentioned, the number 2 role came to us at the suggestion of Governor Abbott, and then at the time during Hurricane Harvey, DHS Secretary Elaine Duke, and that was standing up the first short-term housing mission in partnership with FEMA, one in which that we will continue in the event that the state of Texas gets another federal declaration. Third, we also are the long-term housing partner with HUD to help communities recover, whether that takes it in the form of single-family houses or multifamily developments through our state. I know the team will be giving an update on existing operations as it relates to Harvey after this call, because we really wanted to focus on point number 1, and that's preparing the state for the next one. And then finally is mitigation against future storms. So as you know, HUD made a historically large appropriation, or that they will be managing and providing oversight to a historically large appropriation from Congress in response to Hurricane Harvey. And so as the action plan has been completed, we have some news to report to you in terms of that development. And so the work never ends. COVID-19 has not impacted operations. I'm proud to report to you that all of us are working remotely safely and in a healthy manner. So with that, I wanted to introduce our special guest, Dr. Jerry Bell. As mentioned, he's briefed us on a prior occasion. We're really lucky to have him. He's the nation's preeminent climate forecaster. He usually gets headlines this time of year because of his predictions or projections in terms of how we're looking. We're hoping the doctor has some good news for us, though we're hearing about a tropical disturbance potentially in the Gulf of Mexico just this week. But doctor, we'll turn it over to you. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you all for being here. Well, as you were just heard, hurricane season is here. Regardless of the outlook, you need to prepare for every hurricane season because we all know it only takes one storm to make for a very bad year if it strikes your area. As we've seen with Harvey and other storms, once they make landfall and do so much damage, then areas are compromised for the next year or for the next storm. So that even makes hurricane preparations even more challenging. So to put the Atlantic storm season into perspective, this is a map of Atlantic storm tracks back over the last 20 years or so. And there's this yellow box, that's called the main development region. That's where if you're going to have an active season, a lot of storms are going to develop in that area. This is the area where storms can flourish. A lot of storms can form here and they can become very intense. If you're going to have an active season, more activity there. If it's going to be a suppressed season, you'll have relatively little activity in the main development region. Now, here's why that area is so important. This is the red arrow showing a typical track for these storms. They generally head westward or northwestward and then recurve out to sea. So a lot of these storms are mainly a maritime issue and aren't so much a direct threat of making landfall. But because they're already heading to the northwest, every storm that forms has the potential to head a little bit further west and strike land. Another set of tracks, they head due west through the Caribbean Sea and into the Gulf of Mexico. Once a storm gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it's going to make landfall because the Gulf is surrounded by land. Now, here's what happens during more active seasons like we're expecting this year. That red arrow shifts westward. So the probability of hurricanes even more threatening or making landfall in the United States goes up. So it's not just more storms, it's more storms making landfall. This year, we're expecting an above normal season, a 60% chance of an above normal season, and that's a lot of activity. We're expecting 13 to 19 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 6 major hurricanes. And you can see where each of those ranges is centered quite a bit above the averages, which are 12 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Now, the last 4 seasons have already been above normal. So if this is above normal again this year, it would set a record for 5 consecutive above normal seasons. Now, remember, these outlooks are for the overall seasonal activity. They're not a hurricane landfall forecast. And the reason is that how many storms strike, how strong they are when they strike, the damage they do, and so on, that really depends on the weather patterns that are in place at the time that the storm is approaching. And those weather patterns are not predictable more than about 5 days in advance, let alone a couple of months in advance. So let's look at where we are with this outlook and put it kind of into a historical perspective. This is a time series of the number of Atlantic major hurricanes per season going back to 1950. And the 2020 outlook is here on the red in the right, predicting 3 to 6 major hurricanes. What you see is that this level of activity is comparable to what we've been seeing since 1995. We've been in a high activity era for Atlantic hurricanes since 1995. And in fact, 2/3 of seasons since 95 have been above normal. We saw a similar above normal period in the 50s and 60s, and then the climate pattern switched, and we would really suppress during 70s, 80s, early 90s, where there were only a few seasons with even 3 major hurricanes, let alone 4, 5, and 6. So if you look at these averages, again, we're in a high activity era for Atlantic hurricanes. We're seeing more hurricanes and more major hurricanes. In the 50s and 60s, we averaged about 3 major hurricanes per season. Then in that low activity era, we averaged only 1.5 major hurricanes per season. And now we're back up above averaging 3 or more major hurricanes per season. We're still in the climate pattern that is allowing for more storms and stronger storms. There's no indication that this high activity era has ended. So the bottom line is roughly double the number of major hurricanes during high activity eras. And as I mentioned, we're still in this high activity era that began in 1995. Historically, these periods, if you look back into the 1800s to the present, historically they last about 25 to 40 years. So we're 25 years into this current high activity era, and there's really no way to predict how much longer it's going to last. One of the key features that allows for stronger seasons, high activity eras, things like that, is the vertical wind shear. The vertical wind shear refers to the change in wind speed and direction going up through the atmosphere. So what I'm showing on the left is on the top left is a picture of storm clouds. This is kind of looking sideways through the storm clouds of a hurricane. And I've indicated the eye wall, that's where the strongest winds are for the hurricane, and that's where the strongest rainfall is, and so on. And you see the schematic for the eye of the hurricane. And now what I've indicated is the lower level winds and upper level winds at about jet stream level. I've shown them both out of the east here at roughly the same size of arrow or roughly the same magnitude. So what I'm showing here is a situation with little change in wind speed and direction. That's weak wind shear. That's what hurricanes love. If a developing disturbance moves into a weak shear, it can often strengthen very quickly. If a hurricane moves into a region of weak shear, it can intensify very rapidly. And what you see on the satellite picture for a major hurricane, that's when you've got the eye, the well-defined rain bands and so on, eye wall. That's a typical structure that you see with weak wind shear. Now, in contrast, on the top right is a schematic showing a picture of strong wind shear. And in this case, the lower level winds are out of the east, upper level winds are out of the west. So there's a large change in wind direction going up through the atmosphere. This is strong wind shear. If hurricanes move into an area of strong shear, they can get ripped apart. If there's strong wind shear, a developing disturbance may not form at all. And what you see on the satellite picture, you can actually see the impacts of the shear. This is a picture of a hurricane getting sheared apart or ripped apart. The upper level clouds, the bright white clouds, are completely displaced. You kind of see the ring of the lower level circulation here. The vertical structure of a major hurricane on the left is completely gone. This storm is dissipating. And that's one of the factors that we use for predicting the overall strength of the hurricane season, as well as individual storms, the vertical wind shear. Well, this year, there's possible reinforcing factors likely to give us an above normal season. The first is the conditions that have been associated with this ongoing high activity era that we've been in since 1995. This climate pattern is called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or AMO. This is the pattern that gives us the high and low activity periods. The one I'm showing is for the high activity era, and that's associated with warmer water and weaker wind shear in the main development region, and also warmer water at the higher latitudes of the North Atlantic, and very importantly, a stronger West African monsoon. A stronger monsoon sets up an entire set of wind and air pressure patterns, so as these disturbances move westward from Africa, they move over progressively warmer water and weaker wind shear, and that's a ripe environment to intensify. These are the conditions we're expecting again this year. Another player in the seasonal hurricane game and in individual storms is what's called the El Nino-La Nina cycle. El Nino and La Nina are a tropical Pacific Ocean climate phenomenon. El Nino tends to suppress Atlantic hurricanes. We're not expecting El Nino, so we're not expecting anything to suppress these high activity era conditions. Instead, it may be that La Nina develops this year. La Nina refers to where it's cooler and drier across the central and eastern equatorial Pacific. What that does is it affects the rainfall patterns in such a way as to change the upper level wind pattern and create weaker wind shear, again, in that tropical Atlantic main development region. So there's two scenarios we're looking at right now. Expect above normal activity because of the ongoing high activity era. But there's two scenarios, as I just said. The one is if we continue with neutral conditions in the Pacific, meaning no El Nino or La Nina, there's nothing to suppress that high activity era signal. However, if La Nina develops, that would reinforce the high activity era conditions, possibly producing activity near the upper ends of our predicted ranges. Well, now that, because we're in a high activity era, we are seeing more hurricane landfalls. And this is what the outlooks are all about, is getting prepared for the hurricane season. Just in the last couple of years, we've had several significant landfalls in the U.S. Michael in Florida last year, it's 2018. Florence in the Carolinas in 2018. Harvey in Texas, Irma in Florida in 2017. And not directly for the continental U.S., but we had Major Hurricane Dorian last year, caused just almost catastrophic damage in Abacos Island and Grand Bahama Island. And also 2 years ago in 2017, we had Hurricane Maria really just decimate Puerto Rico. So if we look at landfalling U.S. hurricanes during high and low activity eras, again, just focusing on the U.S., continental U.S. now, the blue bar shows the average number of on the left, average number of landfalling hurricanes per season during the high activity eras. The red bar shows it during the lower activity era. So there's about a 37% increase in landfalling U.S. hurricanes. The biggest percentage increase is along the Atlantic coast, about an 85% increase, almost a doubling in the number of U.S. Atlantic coast landfalling hurricanes. The Gulf Coast percentage-wise doesn't see that much of an increase because even in both high and low activity eras, hurricanes are more frequent along the Gulf Coast. But there's another thing we see with these high activity eras. We have almost a doubling of seasons with multiple landfalling hurricanes. And there I mean two or more. So an example would be one hurricane striking the Gulf Coast, a different hurricane striking the Atlantic coast. During high activity eras, we see these multiple landfalling hurricanes about every other year compared to about every fourth year. Now, this current high activity that we're in follows decades, and we all know this, decades of tremendous growth in coastal and near coastal regions. And in fact, now 80 million people are considered Atlantic or Gulf Coast residents that could be impacted by a tropical storm or hurricane. And that number is so high because these storms oftentimes can have very long inland tracks and produce tremendous flooding even well away from the coast. So just because you don't live along the direct coast doesn't mean you're not in potential threat from these storms. 22 million people, according to NOAA, in the United States are vulnerable to a storm surge. The storm surge is where the ocean comes on shore. Storm surges destroy everything. This is a picture of Hurricane Michael in 2018, making landfall in Florida. Hurricane Michael struck. It was the second strongest storm on record to strike the continental United States. Picture this as a map. You're looking down at the hurricane. The arrow indicates the center of the hurricane. Towns, your house, you and me, we're tiny little dots on the scale of a hurricane. That's how big these things are. They affect millions of people. And because the coastlines are so built up, there's so many more millions of people threatened every time a storm, or so many potentially more people impacted every time a storm threatens. So as I mentioned, Michael was the strongest storm since Andrew in 92 to make landfall. And one of the things about it was that it developed very rapidly down in the southern Gulf of Mexico and raced northward. In only 2 days, Michael went from Cuba at 100-mile-an-hour maximum winds to strike the Florida Panhandle here in the picture with 160-mile-an-hour winds. That meant there's 2 days for people to get out of there. It produced a storm surge of 9 to 14 feet, did complete destruction of parts of Mexico Beach and Panama City. And here was a case where this pre-storm preparedness and being able to evacuate so quickly saved untold number of lives. Sometimes you have a lot more, maybe 3-4 days with a storm approaching to evacuate, but here was a situation where it needed to be done, and it needed to be done now. Now, Michael was a fast-moving storm, but we know that slow-moving or stalled storms can also wreak havoc. This is Major Hurricane Dorian last year in the Bahamas. I'm indicating the eye and the eye wall there. As I said, it just decimated Abacos and Grand Bahama Island. This is a picture from Grand Bahama Island of homes. This had a massive storm surge over 20 feet. 45% of the homes in those islands were severely damaged or completely destroyed. Now, if you look at the top left again, I'm indicating the center of that storm was 90 miles from Florida. Had the weather patterns not been just right, that storm could easily have made landfall and stalled in southern Florida. So even though the continental U.S. got spared, it was still under significant potential threat, and people needed to be ready. Now, this is a picture of Harvey, of course, making landfall in southeastern Texas in 2017. Made landfall with 130-mile-an-hour winds. But one of its, I wanted to back up for just a second. Part of this damage from Dorian was the fact that it stalled over the Bahamas. Harvey came on shore and stalled over Texas. So instead, when storms stall, instead of maybe 10, 15, 20 inches of rain, you're looking at 20, 30, 40, and in Harvey's case, 50 plus inches of rain. Again, a big storm surge, 10 to 12 feet, but by far the biggest impact was the catastrophic flooding from the 30 to 60 inches of rain that Harvey produced. And almost 160,000 homes were flooded. So one of the things that you need to know in preparing for the hurricane season is know if you're in an evacuation zone or a flood zone. When you get these big hurricanes and they produce a lot of rain, you can wind up in what's a flooded area that normally would not be listed as a floodplain. In fact, a lot of the homes during Harvey were outside the 100-year floodplain. So you need to determine, should you have or do you need flood insurance? Normal homeowners insurance does not cover these floods. And also now, once a storm is approaching, you want to make sure you're keeping abreast of conditions during the storm. And one thing that a product that's been of a big help in just the last several years is a storm surge prediction map produced by the National Hurricane Center. So this is a schematic prediction of a storm surge. We got Houston over here on the left, and the shading indicates the predicted levels of the storm surge. So in this case, the reds are indicating higher than 9 feet of storm. This is great because it allows emergency managers and officials to help focus evacuations to where they need to happen, and it allows areas that are not in an imminent storm surge threat or a threat at all to not be evacuated. So it really helps us to better manage the evacuation process. So for your hurricane plans, they need to reflect several things. They need to reflect your personal situation and your vulnerabilities, your kids, pets, elderly, medical conditions, so on. And also they need to reflect the storm conditions you might expect, because depending on where you are, near the coastline or farther inland, you're going to have different potential impacts from the hurricane. One, of course, is this is Bolivar Peninsula in Texas after our Hurricane Ike in 2008. You're near the coast, if you're told to evacuate, get out. Storm surges destroy everything. Maybe your biggest impact is inland flooding. Check flood insurance, make sure you know what to do. If you're flooded out, make sure you know where to go. Have a plan. Maybe your biggest impacts are devastating winds and down trees and power lines. Maybe you're going to be hunkering down at home for a week. Your preparedness plans, your hurricane preparedness kits need to reflect a whole host of conditions associated with that. There's tornadoes during hurricanes, so you can get even localized areas of further damage. And then more on the ocean now, rip currents, strong waves, battering waves destroy boats, docks, retaining walls, and so on. Maybe you don't live along the coast. Maybe you live in Ohio, but you have a boat, say along the coastline. You need to make sure that it's moored correctly and safely so that it doesn't get destroyed. So the bottom line on all this, again, is that you are your first line of defense if a hurricane strikes. This year, we're looking at another above normal season. We're looking at 13 to 19 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 6 major hurricanes. And again, that's a lot of activity. But regardless of the outlook for this year, you need to prepare for every hurricane season, because we all know it just takes one storm striking your area to make for a very bad year. There's a couple of great websites to help you prepare, ready.gov and hurricanes.gov. They walk through very common sense things that you can do and get ready now so that you're ready if a storm threatens. Because the time to start preparing for a storm is not when the hurricane is going to hit you 3 days from now. You just can't prepare and evacuate in panic mode. You're going to be a wreck. Do it now, get ready for the season. And remember, it only takes one. Be ready and take action so that if a storm does threaten, you're prepared. So that's all I had. Thank you very much. And now I'll pass it over to GLO Chief Clerk, Mark Havens.
Thank you. All right, are we on there? Thank you, Dr. Bell. Excellent presentation. I can't say that I feel better after the presentation, but I certainly do feel more informed, which is truly why we're here today. So, and if anybody, just want to put it out there, if anybody has any questions for Dr. Bell or anything regarding his presentation, please send them to cdr@recovery.texas.gov. As Commissioner Bush mentioned earlier, my name is Mark Havens. I'm the Deputy Commissioner here at the Land Office. And Heather and I will be covering what you can do to prepare your communities prior to the storm, and then also specifically what role the Land Office plays post-storm. Shortly after this, we're going to transition into our monthly elected officials update, which we wanted to, we conduct these on the first Monday of every month, but we wanted to combine these two because so many of our partners on this local elected officials play a large role with this Hurricane Outlook webinar as well. As the Commissioner briefly mentioned, we really have 4 roles of disaster recovery that work in tandem. One is preparing Texans before the storm. We do that by what we're doing today here, organizing this Hurricane Outlook webinar, continually monitoring storm systems, keeping in touch with our local, regional, state, and federal partners. And so we try to do everything we can on the front end to help prepare Texans before. Then the second role is assisting them with the short-term housing and housing immediately post-storm. The third portion of that is providing long-term housing solutions to bring storm survivors home. And then something new post-Harvey is mitigation against future storms through infrastructure improvements and planning studies. It was interesting when okay, I was getting a message. Are we okay on the mics? When we have managed long-term housing solutions here at the GLO for years. To Harvey, as Dr. Bell showed earlier, with all of the activity going on in 2017, and it's the historic storm that Harvey was. Governor Abbott, for the first time ever, tapped Commissioner Bush to lead the short-term housing mission. So this was typically when FEMA comes in and handles all of called short-term disaster recovery. GLO stepped in and handled all of that. And it was the first time a state had ever partnered with the federal government to do this. So we still stand ready to do that should we be asked again, and we will transition from short-term housing into the long-term housing. I know Heather and shortly is going to cover the short-term housing piece of this. Once we move past that, the long-term housing is what we've really been focused on, honestly, since 2011. We have HUD, CDBG, DR funds. These are appropriated by Congress, pushed out through U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And it provides eligible disaster recovery activities, housing, infrastructure repair, buying out risk-prone properties, and economic revitalization. Currently, the focus, everyone seems to, the focus is on Harvey, but the GLO is managing CDBG DR funds for hurricanes Ike, Dolly, Bastrop wildfires, 2015, 2016 flood disasters, Hurricane Harvey, and now as well as 2018 and 2019 flooding. As you can see, there's a lot of repeated flooding activities in there. So one of the things that HUD has done is put out mitigation funds. This was the first time ever that HUD looked to see, okay, we've put all this money into housing. How can we help mitigate against future storm risk? And so we're managing mitigation funding as we go forward along with the housing dollars. We're going to have some more in-depth discussion on the mitigation funding. We've got some announcements coming up regarding that and timelines and how that can affect local communities. So we'll be talking about that with our on our monthly elected officials calls. So as we enter the 2020 hurricane season, we have a lot of moving parts, and we're going to continue to emphasize preparedness and help that everyone know that we stand at the ready to serve all Texans through the short term, the long term, and the mitigation funding. I'd like to bring in now Heather Lagrone, our Senior Deputy Director of CDR, and to talk about what we can do there. Heather?
Good morning, everybody. Like everyone has mentioned, I am Heather Lagrone. I'm the Senior Deputy for the CDR program for the Land Office. And as the Commissioner mentioned earlier, we are particularly talking to you about preparedness. This is the opportunity where communities and individuals can gather their supplies, including, because of COVID now, our personal protective gear. Securing all the copies of your important documents, your deeds, your insurance policies, etc. And as Dr. Bell said, buying that flood insurance now. It does take 30 days for that flood insurance policy to become active once you purchase it, and they do not sell them when there's a hurricane bubbling in the Gulf. And lastly, you should definitely be looking at making evacuation plans for your family, determining how you're going to handle your pets, how you're going to handle your medications, which routes you're going to take, which alternate routes may be available for you to take should that primary route not be available. FEMA has recently released some guidance that relates to preparing for a hurricane during the COVID-19 pandemic. I would definitely recommend that you go online and look at that. There are details there that you as community leaders and your emergency managers could definitely consider for implementation into your plans that you currently utilize. And as a community, I would definitely recommend again that you are preparing for your event and that you document any damage. Following a storm, any appropriation that we receive is going to have a tieback requirement where we're looking for you to prove the damage that you sustained. Everybody has a camera in their pockets these days, and a picture is worth 1,000 words in this instant. In 2011, Governor Perry designated the Texas General Land Office as the lead agency for long-term disaster recovery, and that was renewed by Governor Abbott. One thing that you should definitely consider, however, is that CDBG DR declarations come with a congressional action after a presidentially declared disaster, but only 15% of presidential disasters receive these additional supplemental funds. The CDBG funds are longer term funding, so they have a little bit more definition and requirement to them. The primary focus of the CDBG program is to benefit low to moderate income people. In that benefit, we are looking at the majority of the funds being spent either in areas that are wholly or partially low to moderate income in the majority, or preventing or eliminating slum and blight, meeting an urgent need. The distinction between a short-term housing program and a long-term housing program is simply that. A short-term housing program is temporary. This is getting somebody back into their home, albeit not a complete home, but dry, safe, sanitary, for them to move home, move back to their communities, go back to work, go back to school. Generally, these types of events that we're talking about are covered for 18 months. After that 18 months, the expectation is that the individual has moved on and has taken care of their recovery themselves. In larger events like Harvey, that may not be possible, in that it can be extended longer and additional funding can be made available from the federal government. In Harvey, we were able to house almost 20,000 households with our short-term housing recovery program that we were tasked with doing. The long-term recovery program is the CDBG funded program. That's the longer funded program. This actually gets you back to norm. This builds you back your house. This is the house that will sustain the next event. More to come on this, but we have over 1,300 families who have gone back into their Harvey damaged homes as a result of the CDBG DR program. Those 1,300 households will be in a stronger, more wind resistant, more flood resistant home in time for hurricane season. And hopefully they won't need all of those features, but they will be there should they need them. One distinction from the short-term housing to the long-term housing that I'd like to point out to you is that we can improve and harden beyond pre-event conditions. The short-term housing program is a program to patch the things that were damaged. So think of it as more of a Blue Tarps program, as opposed to the CDBG program can replace the roof. The long-term recovery program is not a quick program to happen though. This program can take several months, if not years, to fully come into operation, and then years to follow to complete. First and foremost, the governor requests a presidential declaration and the president must declare the event. From there, if the event is strong enough and there's not enough funding through the FEMA programs that are conventionally set up in disasters, Congress can appropriate additional funds for long-term recovery. Once those funds are appropriated by Congress, HUD has to publish federal registers or the rules that are associated with the CDBG regulations. The governor of the state who was impacted by an event, in our case, the GLO, designates an entity to work with CDBG, DR, and HUD. And in our case, again, the GLO developed a state action plan, and it talks about all of the laws, regulations, and programs that we will implement. Once HUD approves that action plan, then the GLO can initiate those programs and begin working with either straight allocations or competitive scoring for the programs that we selected. As I mentioned, this is a very lengthy process. On the average, we have seen it take as much as 2 years for us to go from the disaster event to the actual approval of and use of funds. So looking across the board, the first 12 months we spend getting a disaster declaration from HUD. The second year, we're looking at congressional appropriations. We write the action plan in that second year. And ideally, by the end of that second year, we have our appropriations and programs up and operational. That concludes my presentation as it relates to our preparedness and how the GLO works directly with the CDBG, DR, and the FEMA programs. At this point, I'd like to hand it back to the commissioner.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you all once again for joining us for this year's beginning of hurricane season preparedness webinar. As a little bit of swag that we're going to be handing out, staff will be following up with all the county judges. No offense to our legislators or mayors here, but we're going to be sending to the county courthouses emergency document bags for your constituents. If you request more, please email us on the Q&A tab on your screen, or email us at cdr@recovery.texas.gov. If you have any follow-up questions at all, let us know. We're always here 24/7 getting ready for this season. And once again, want to thank our staff. Sometimes, the elected officials get all the credit and the limelight, but it's important that we recognize the contributions that many of you on this call, the grant administrators, the emergency responders, do to make this all happen. And so we thank you and we tip our hat to you. Once again, want to thank the good doctor from NOAA for an incredible presentation. We were hoping for some better projections there, Doctor, but we'll get you next time. And with that, we'll turn it back to Mark and Heather for the monthly update for elected officials.